Thank you so much for joining us this evening, everyone, for our final AIA LA book talk of the spring term. My name is Ken Seligson. I'm the secretary of the AIA LA Society. It's really great to see you all here this evening. We are recording this for anyone who would like to check out the talk later on, and it'll be posted to our YouTube channel. It is my great pleasure to introduce this evening's AIA LA Book Talk speaker, Dr. Jerry D. Moore. Dr. Moore earned his MA and PhD from UC Santa Barbara. He is professor of anthropology at CSU Dominguez Hills and editor of Ñaupapacha Journal of Andean Archaeology. His research explores cultural landscapes in Peru and Baja California, investigations supported by the National Science Foundation, the Wenner Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research, and other institutions. Dr. Moore has held fellowships at Dumbarton Oaks, the Sainsbury Center for the Arts, University of East Anglia, the Getty Research Institute, and the Institute of Advanced Study at Durham University. A prolific author, his books include Architecture and Power in the Pre-Hispanic Andes, The Archaeology of Public Buildings, published by Cambridge University Press in 1996, Cultural Landscapes in the Pre-Hispanic Andes, Archaeologies of Place, The Prehistory of Home, A Prehistory of South America, Ancient Cultural Diversity of the Least Known Continent, Incidents of Travel, Recent Journeys in Ancient South America, and his most recent book, which he will be presenting this evening, Ancient Andean Houses, Making, Inhabiting, Studying, published by the University Press of Florida in December 2021. We are honored to have him here with us this evening, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Jerry Moore.
Well, thank you very much. So we've got some hands up. Ask to unmute. Oh, I'm muted, I think. There we are.
You're okay.
Am I okay?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks very much.
You're just getting some applause.
Oh, that was applause? I so rarely receive that I didn't recognize that gesture. So anyway, thanks all, to everyone for making time to join us tonight. And as Ken said, I work a lot on houses, home, and the domestic experience. And today I want to just briefly explore something that I kind of blundered into. And I think that that's one of the great things that happens when you're able to do work on a topic over a sustained period of time, is that because you keep going back and back to similar topics, there's the opportunity to see things that you perhaps didn't see the first 1, 2, or 3 times that you wrote about a particular matter. And so today is one of those instances. And I've kind of whimsically titled it A King's Castle is His Home. But what I really want to do is think about the kind of the domestic experience of place in royal architecture on the north coast of Peru, particularly at the site of Chan Chan. Now, it's not at all particularly innovative to think that we might be interested in palaces. I mean, after all, archaeologists and political scientists and architects and artists, et cetera, have been focusing on palaces for centuries now. But they play kind of a unique role in the domestic sphere because they are the kind of intersections of multiple domains of activities in which the domestic and the political and the economic, and in this case, the military, all intersect. And I think that poses particular challenges for archaeologists to try to understand exactly what's going on in a high status / royal / palace architecture. And this in turn, let's see here, what happened? I wanted to go next slide. Let's see here.
Jerry, would you be able to maximize your screen by clicking there at the bottom right?
at the bottom right.
Just to the left, the button just left of the percentage slider.
Just left the percentage slider.
Yeah, so
Yep.
just a little bit left of that. No, just a little left of it's a button. Just left of the 40.
That?
No, go to, sorry, to your left, to the left of the slider. One more, keep going. You were almost there. No, don't use the, sorry, don't use the plus minus, use.
Great. Are we ready?
Mhm.
Okay. So in addition to our obvious kind of fascination with royalty and palaces, we also have this weird legal set of precedents in English common law that's basically encoded in American law about this relationship between man's house and his castle. A pretty sexist comment when you think about it, but it is this idea that each man's home is his safest refuge. But the question I want to explore today is kind of the inverse of that, which is, when is a king's castle actually a home? And that leads me to, there are my slides. A number of places where this has been explored, obviously in the greater Mediterranean. So this is the palace complex at Knossos that, as Colin Renfrew and others have described, as really the seat of a palace polity. And then if we look at Mycenae, you know, this great site that we actually had the opportunity to go and visit. I'm really happy to have seen this. It's a remarkable combination of citadel, residence, storage, water supply, religious structures, all those different sorts of things. And this, from one of the codices, is an image of Moctezuma's palace, which is unfortunately the only image that I have that has anything to do with Cinco de Mayo today. In other words, what I'm saying here is that my interest in palaces and architecture as residents, it's really not particularly path-breaking at all. But what I am trying to suggest is that thinking about how these palaces may or may not, at least in part, reflect larger sets of a culture's domestic experience, that I think is worth exploring a bit more. And I do this to some extent in my recent book, Ancient Andean Houses, that just came out in December, and from which today's talk is largely drawn. But as those of you who have, you know, some of my colleagues are here and we've known for decades, those of you who know me know that a huge chunk of my work has really revolved around home, whether it's been my earlier studies of archaeology of public buildings, the writings on the prehistory of home. And, you know, the reason for that is that I just find that so many interesting aspects of the human experience orbit around that domestic pivot. It's like it's like one of those places in the human experience, along with the grave or the hearth, that has this centripetal power, that home is one of these places to which we imbue multiple sets of meanings. And what you're seeing in this slide here is a combination of a great image from the Nukok that Gustavo Politis loaned me, and 3 other images from that great book, Material Worlds, which did a survey of the average home in multiple countries around the world, and had them bring out all of their possessions and put them in front of their house, and they took pictures of it. And so here we have one in Bhutan, here we have one in the Silicon Valley. This, I think, is from a historic image. And you just get this sense about how extraordinarily rich that domestic sphere is, not only in terms of as being a container of objects and an enclosure of actions, but also the way it is imbued with multiple sets of meanings. And parsing that out, or parsing those things out, I should say, is really at the heart of my larger research project, basically for the last 25 or 30 years. So with that, I'm going to shift to the north coast of Peru, to the site of Chan Chan that I think many of you are familiar with, and many of you have traveled to. But it's a really interesting place where architecture and home, by extension, can be explored. And the data that I'm going to be talking about from Chan Chan are largely the result of this very ambitious project that Michael Mosley and Carol Mackey directed in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And in addition to their leadership, there were multiple PhD students who went on to have illustrious careers and who worked on different aspects of this large urban center of Chan Chan, as well as other sites and topics related to the Moche Valley. Now, I think it's worth noting, and excuse me for a sec. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge as scholars that every piece of our research, every way that we look at problems, is inevitably influenced by not only the projects that are going on and the problems that are being articulated at the time that we're doing our research, but also by the previous generation of projects that influence the ways in which not only theoretical questions are posed, but also the ways that basic methodological tactics are employed. And as I write about pretty extensively in the Ancient Andean Houses book, the Chan Chan Moche Valley project was really influenced in both fundamental and very detailed ways by projects like Gordon Willie's Veru Valley project, Rene Mion's and George Kogel's Teotihuacan mapping project, and the Basin of Mexico project directed by William Sanders and others. Mike and Carol really saw and have articulated the intellectual and methodological connections between the Chan Chan Moche Valley project and those earlier projects. And I think that has been somewhat overlooked in Andean archaeology. And because I think there's somewhat of a tendency to treat Andean archaeology as if it's kind of an insulated domain of research. And I'm trying to argue that that's not the case. But that's a different discussion. That's a larger discussion than we need to have tonight. But their focus was on Chan Chan, obviously, as well as other prominent sites in the Moche Valley, the sites like Huaca de la Luna, Galindo, and also various doctoral students worked on topics such as subsistence changes, the way that Sheila Pazorski did. But a major effort, a major focus of the research was mapping Chan Chan. And the maps that were produced remain an extraordinarily useful set of data that we're lucky to have. Let's see, next slide. There we are. Just to locate us, we're talking about the north coast of Peru, and Chanchan is located here in the lower Moche Valley. And this map, I think, overstates the extent of the Chimu Empire and this yellow area, but it gives us a sense of where the Chimu sites were principally located and where Chanchan is. So I think that this map of the empire is something of an exaggeration, but Chanchan is not an exaggeration. Chanchan is dominated by these large walled enclosures made from tapia walls that are known as ciudadelas. And these are enormous, and they dominate the urban landscape of Chanchan. They're not the only thing that's there, but they're certainly a dominant part of that urban landscape. And this kind of simplified drawing shows some of the major ciudadelas, as they're known, the walled enclosures that are named. And I have to say that there's been a movement in the last several years to try to establish the indigenous Muchik names for these different places, but I'm not going to go into that just to because I think it just kind of overly complicates the discussion, since these names are used both in the English and Spanish literature, and so I'm just going to stick with those. But I acknowledge that that's another line of research that's being done. So you have these big walled enclosures. You have these kind of standalone mounds that are known as wakas. And then you have interspersed between them both these barrios, or kind of lower class residential areas, as well as another kind of architecture, which is seen as being intermediate between the domestic architecture of the barrio and the ciudadela architecture. Okay. And here are some basic aspects of Chanchan. The Chimu Empire, as far as we know right now, lasts between about AD 900, some would say 1000 to 1470. Chanchan has this urban core that we were just looking at of 6 square kilometers, has a larger overall area. The population's estimated to be between 30 to 40,000, which is pretty large for Andean sites. And again, the ciudadelas dominate the urban landscape. And these walls, as I note here, they're up to 9 meters tall, and they enclose vast areas. In fact, areas that are significantly larger than, or within the, including and larger than Buckingham Palace, for instance. Within them, there are these interesting features. So there are burial platforms, which, with only 2 exceptions, all of the known Chimu burial platforms are located within the ciudadelas at Chanchan, which that's a distinctive pattern. But in addition to which, there are wells where they've actually excavated all the way down to the water table to get access to fresh water. There are storerooms by the score, and there are these structures called audiencias, which are 3-sided or U-shaped structures with niches in them that seem to have been placed in pivotal locations within the internal organization of the ciudadelas. Another thing about the ciudadelas that's interesting is that the overall enclosure has a single doorway. And it's usually a baffled entry, which is this idea that you walk in and you don't just walk in, but there's a wall there and you have to turn to your right, and then you can go on into the structure. And that idea of the baffled entry is something that I'm going to come back to. But overall, one of the models that comes out of the Chanchan Moche project is that architecture is used to control access. And this becomes one of the major conclusions and emphases of the Chan Chan Moche project when it looks at architecture. One, it looks at architecture as an index of distinct labor investments, and there's really no way to debate that. The second thing is that there are different sets of activities that are in different kinds of architecture. For example, all the plazas are within ciudadelas, whereas all the workshops are in the barrio regions that are called small irregular agglutinated rooms, a somewhat awkward acronym that is directly influenced by the terminology that Gordon Willey used in the Peru Valley. Okay, we could talk about that later if you wanted, but the overarching theme that comes out of the study of architecture is that architecture is an index of socioeconomic divisions, and one of the things it emphasizes is social control, access, and that's what's organizing, that's what's driving the architectural plan here. Again, this was a major mapping project. And it's hard to believe that in our total station ArcGIS days, that these maps were all produced with plane table and alidade. We are so lucky that they were, because they produced a record of architecture that is extraordinarily useful for our understanding of the Chimu. So this, for instance, is one of the the smallest of the ciudadelas. This is Ciudadela Tello. It measures about 6.7 hectares in area, and you see some of the aspects of Ciudadela architecture. And you see immediately how people would make these inferences about architecture as a mechanism of social control. This entire complex is a single entrance, right? There's one thing right there. Once you move into this complex, there is pretty tight control to get to areas of different functions. So for instance, this entire block has a single entrance that leads to this entire block. And within it, you have a variety of architectural features. You've got plazas, which is with benches, which is indicated here. You've got these banks of storerooms that are located here. You've got a walk-in well and other structures, all within the confines of the ciudadela. Now that's very distinct. Well, actually, what I should say is that it is distinct, but has elements that are common with the so-called intermediate architecture, which Ulana Clemician focused her research on. And this is kinds of architecture that are smaller than the ciudadelas, but have some of the same components as we see in the larger complexes. So there are wells in some of these intermediate architecture. There's storage, but not as much as we see in the ciudadelas. And there are these three-sided rooms and other kinds and smaller plazas. Again, an architectural form that seems to link to the larger ciudadelas, but be not only smaller in scale, but diminished in the variety of its activities. And then if we get to the barrios, what we see is a completely different pattern in which you see clear evidence for domestic activities, plus all this evidence for craft production. So John Topic documented evidence for metallurgy, for woodworking, for weaving, all of which is occurring in these smaller complexes. And again, one of the other distinctive features of them is that they're not these massive tapia walls as we saw on the ciudadelas, but rather they seem to be cobblestone foundations with adobe and other sorts of less impressive architecture on top of them. So this leads to a series of inferences on the part of the project. And one of them is that architecture is a medium of social control. And this is a quote from Kent Day from the book that came out of this research, in which he argues the socioeconomic system elaborated by the Chimu was imperfect. The overwhelming concern with security expressed in the controlled access, high walls, and tortuous corridors of ciudadelas indicates a profound social and economic gulf between royalty and the rest of the population. And that idea is really fundamental for thinking about the way we've been thinking about Chimu architecture in general. It was only reinforced by the discovery of this, one of the most remarkable artifacts, I think, ever discovered in Andean archaeology, which is actually a maqueta, a model of a plaza in a Chimu ciudadela, in which the mummy of the king is being feted, being honored by a group of musicians, of chicha bearers, various other offerings. And the thing about this maqueta, it's about, oh, I don't know, it's about 60 centimeters from one side to the other. And it was discovered by Santiago, the late Santiago Uceda and others at an excavation at the site of Moche. But the cool thing about this is all of these wooden figurines had small holes bored into the feet of the wooden figurines, and they had been stitched into place. All right. So that when it was discovered, even though they'd fallen forward, you could just tip them back and see what the creator actually meant about their position and their pose. And this is it's one of the most amazing artifacts I've ever seen in my life. And it's on display at the museum at the Huacas de la Luna. Now, what's interesting about that is that this Chimu architecture looks really different from the depictions of royal architecture that we have from the immediately preceding Moche culture, in which these Moche architectural models and also Moche fine line drawings clearly show elites in relatively in impressive and decorated structures, but they're not nearly of the magnitude and size of what we see with the Chimu. Okay, so that's interesting, and we can talk about that later if there are any questions about that. The other thing that's interesting is that this Chimu architecture has virtually nothing in common with the Inca architecture. And we know so much about Inca architecture through the work of multiple scholars, but one of whom was a much esteemed and much missed Jean-Pierre Protzen, who's shown there in the lower left picture. And Jean-Pierre not only worked on reconstructing the stoneworking techniques of the Inca, but he did this great study of the Inca and modern community of Ollantaytambo. And this is really a beautiful place if you haven't been there. And it's beautiful even if you have, for that matter. But it's one of the few modern towns that did not destroy the Inca layout of buildings. So people are actually living within the foundations and walls that conform to the Inca plan. And so what we have is a remarkably great insight into Inca architecture. And what we see is that you've got these things that we refer to as conchas or blocks, in which there'll be a set of structures around a relatively small plaza with a single entrance into it. And basically, you move directly from this small plaza into the rooms. And you can see that in this plan of a concha. And basically, this is a city block in which this wall here divides the block into two, and there are these bilateral, almost symmetrical, really, constructions on either side, in which you come in from the street and you move right into the spaces. Now, this is a really common pattern that we see throughout the extent of the Inca Empire. This is a picture from central Ecuador at Inca Pirca, exactly the same plan. And it is fundamentally different from what we know about at Chan Chan. So this is intriguing to me. And I want to now talk a little bit about how I've tried to understand Chimu architecture and their experience of place in other regions of the Chimu Empire. So I was lucky enough to be, as a graduate student, to work on the Proyecto Chimu Sur at Manchan, which was a provincial Chimu center. This project, as I mentioned before, was directed by Carol Mackey and Ilana Commission. And then subsequently, I worked at a nearby site called Quebrada Santa Cristina. And I'll come back to both of those sites in just a moment. However, one of the things that kind of got me on this current line of research was I was reading a really excellent dissertation by Randy Hahn, who had worked at the site in Hequetepeque, and where there seemed to be this baffled entryway gets imposed on top of a local architectural site there. And this is kind of really getting down in the weeds here, but I just want to draw your attention to this sentence where at this particular site, he says, nonetheless, rooms with baffled entryways and niches are often associated with administrative activities or elite living spaces within corporate Chimu architecture, such as those in cidadelas and intermediate elite architecture at Chan Chan. And when I read that sentence, which is a particular, it's very plausible, I thought, is that true? Is that the only places where those baffled entryways are found? And I began searching around, not only in the literature, but in my own work in lower class cane architecture. And I started finding out that, in fact, baffled entryways are one of the most common ways that people make their houses. It's a common feature. And so, again, this is a map of Manchan. My dissertation work was here on these cane structures. And these are the 4 structures that I actually excavated. And they are the remains of undaubed cane wattle structures that look originally something like this. This is a modern example. But what happens is after about 10 years, they get infested with termites and they get sandblasted. So this is the walls. But they get sandblasted down to the stable soil surface, which allows you to just take a broom and sweep them out and come up with really, in many cases, very detailed plans. And so this is excavations that we did. Jan Gasco and I co-directed this project at the site of Quebrada Santa Cristina, also in the Cosmo Valley. And this entire site, and to give you a sense of the scale, right there are 2 of the guys who were working on my project. This entire site was exclusively built from canes. And the structures which are located here were associated with a set of raised agricultural fields, but our excavations resulted in an amazingly detailed map of these cane walled structures, not only because we could see the walls, but if you see these little dots here, those are actually bundles of canes that were used, put together and to be used as door lintels or reinforcing posts. So what was cool about this was that we could look at a pair of these bundled canes and know the difference between whether or not there was a door there or whether or not this was just a place where canes were missing. Okay. And that then later on led me to try to look at access patterns. And I, like everybody who works on this stuff, was indebted to the book in 1984 by Bill Hillier and Julian Hansen on the social logic of space, in which they come up with a really interesting approach to look at these spatial relationships, well, basically access patterns. And what you do is you take these complex architectural patterns and you convert them to a series of dots, basically, which we call vertices, and the connections between them, which are edges. And even in a small 3-room pattern, there's possibility for variations among these. And then, of course, when we get to other kinds of architecture, there's all sorts of potential uses for this way of analyzing the interior experiences of space. And so this is from Quentin Ledison's work on the developments in Bronze Age Crete. But this, I think, is it's a kind of a hoot. Even in the American tradition here, represented by Grant Wood's painting, we can take some of our historic buildings and subject them to this access patterns. And those of you who are recently hired faculty members who are trying to buy houses, I think you'll cringe at the prices that Sears was able to ship out a house to you and where you could build it. This one here is for $1,708. You can get a cozy 8-room house. So I know Ken is cringing at this information, but the point I wanted to make here is that you can take these plans of very different kinds of architecture and compare them in a way that allows for insights that just that you wouldn't be able to gain just by looking at the architectural plans. So now back to Chan Chan and related themes. So what I did years ago is I did access patterns for all of the citadellas at Chan Chan. And this is one, Ciudadela Rivero, and this is the plan, and this is the access pattern that I came up with. And people ask me, well, what kind of program did you use? And I said, well, the program consisted of graph paper, pencils, and rulers. And that's how I developed this pretty interesting access plan for Rivero. And you just see how these different spaces are articulated in this Ciudadela. And that I knew, and I'd known that for a good long time. But only after being kind of triggered by this comment by Randy Hahn did I go back and start looking at the access patterns for these other residential complexes that I knew about from my own work, both at Manchan or discrete units of buildings, discrete units of rooms at the site of Quebrada Santa Cristina. And what I discovered, I think, it certainly surprised me, which that if you basically, the beta index basically takes the rooms and interconnections for these different buildings and plots them against each other. And although there's certainly some outliers here, there's a pretty strong common theme that runs throughout Chimu architecture, regardless of status, regardless of size, regardless of material. And that I did not expect to find. The other thing to note is that when you take that same method and you apply it to the Inca architecture, you come up with a pattern that looks completely different. in which basically you come in off the street and you have immediate access to all those different rooms. So what I think is happening is that these different kinds of Chimu domestic spaces, again, different in size and scale and materials, even in the socioeconomic groups associated with them, there seems to be striking similarities in the ways in which interior space is articulated. It also seems to be the case that the baffled entries, far from being a mark of royal architecture, they're common in all sorts of classes of Chimu domestic architecture and as other more recent kinds of North Coast architecture as well. So although there are clear differences in the scale, the building materials, the intramural functions, and the intended durations of these structures, I think, I'm not absolutely certain of this, but I think there are these unexpected continuities in the experience of the domestic space. But then the question, what does this mean? And it could be that what I'm seeing here is like an unintentional byproduct of building methods. Yeah, there's a great article that Stephen Jay Gould co-wrote on the spandrels of St. Mark's. And he's trying to talk about how not every recurrent feature in biology is the direct reflection of evolutionary pressures. And in a similar way, and actually more germane, it could be that we have these apparent similarities that are really the unintentional byproducts of a building method. And I need to think more about that. It could be, as the Chan Chan project suggested, that this emphasis on chain-like access is in fact a means of controlling access to different sorts of spaces. Although why that would be necessary in a lower class domestic structure, I do not know. But another thing, and again, this is all by way of hypotheses, it could be that there are these notions of what an experience of domestic space should be like, a common experience that cross-cut otherwise vast differences in class, religious position, wealth, etc. And that could be what we're seeing in these data. Or it could be something else that I haven't thought about yet. But with that, I want to acknowledge the various folks that have supported this research. Thank you all, and particularly thanking Ken for setting this up and for asking me to do this. And I would appreciate any questions or comments. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Jerry. That was so amazing. I mean, I don't know how many people here are familiar with the northwest coast of Peru, but I learned a lot, and it was just amazing to see the images of the excavations over the years and the preservation that you have at some of those sites and the evolution of the architecture from different regions, different cultures. So yeah, would anyone like to start us off with a question? I know I have a couple, but who'd like to get us started? You can type in the chat or just ask out loud, whichever works better for you.
Jerry, can you remind us of the relative dates of these structures and the communities they're attached to?
Yeah, the basic duration of the overall Chimu is right around, we think, between AD 900, some folks would say AD 1000, and 1470, when we're pretty certain that's when the Inca conquered them. Specific sites like Manchan fall later in that sequence. And we think that at Quebrada Santa Cristina, we think that that particular community was built in the aftermath of an El Nino in the mid 14th century in order to get a work group down there and build a somewhat anomalous complex of raised agricultural fields. So these different sites have different durations, but all of them are in that ballpark period of about 900 or 1000 to 1470.
And are you seeing subphase distinctions in terms of construction or evolution of these complexes that would, illustrate that these are a byproduct of an accretion of building efforts over time?
I don't really see that in part because the ciudadelas have been remarkably difficult to date. In part because when the original Chanchan Moche project was done, we didn't do as many absolute dates as we do today. And there's been some more recent work on some of the ciudadelas that I just saw, I think in Latin American Antiquity Online in the last couple of weeks, where folks are getting that more fine-grained dating of modifications within particular ciudadelas. But to my knowledge, we don't yet have that for the overall trajectories of Chimu architecture. So that's something that I don't really have a good grasp on. I don't think anyone does.
Thank you.
Yeah, Liz, go ahead.
Hey, thank you, Jerry, for a great talk. I wonder if you could say a few more words about the position and the access to the burial complexes that these citadels contain.
Yeah, that's a great question. The first thing is that, as you might expect, they tend to be located in the portions of the ciudadelas that are most difficult to get to. That's one thing. The other thing now is that it seems highly probable that the entire function of the ciudadela was transformed once the burial platform was created. So that if we can imagine one of the ciudadelas as being a seat of royal power when the king is alive, you might expect to see all sorts of activity areas and things that's going on, functioning kitchens and things of that sort. But once that transformation occurs from palace to mausoleum, we think that all those other kinds of auxiliary activities might have dropped by the wayside, so to speak, and that the entire focus then of activities within the ciudadela shifted to that funerary goal. Right. Yeah. So again, that's that's one of the great things when you've got great preservation. You keep asking more and more difficult questions until you get to the point where you can't answer them. Yeah.
I was going to ask a question similar to Aaron's about the diachronic approach to Chanchan, but you touched on it a little already. But in terms of differences in the environment and climate about 1,000 years ago when it was getting going, was it significantly different as far as we know?
I think not. I mean, as long as we mean by different from now, if we're talking about the pre-Anthropocene, okay? So not now, but maybe as of now in the early 1900s, there seemed to be, a periodic well, we know that there are periodic El Niños. They vary in their intensities and their consequences. One of the ones that I mentioned before seems to be pretty well dated is in the mid to late 1300s. And I think Dan Sandweiss and others would point to other major El Nino events as I remember around 900. But those are episodic, catastrophic events that people seem to have kind of dealt with and reverted back to, reestablished, I should say, previous agricultural and environmental strategies. So, for example, what we don't see are, and Sheila Pozorski in her work on subsistence documents this, we don't see full-scale shifts in fish species, for instance. We don't see dramatic differences even in the plant remains that were recorded, from different time periods. So it seems to be one of these situations where the general pattern is relatively continuous with these dramatic, episodic events that have impacts, but after which environment and human responses to them tend to revert back to the previous way of doing things. So, for example, one of those El Nino events can have devastating consequences for irrigation systems, particularly where the canals take in water. And those can take years to rebuild. But that doesn't mean that irrigation or canal irrigation-based agriculture was eliminated. It's just one of those things that people had to get back to.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions for Jerry? All right, well, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you so much, Jerry, for an amazing talk.
Thank you. Thanks all for being here. And I hope to see more of you in person soon.